Mishra has obtained his bachelor's degree in agricultural science from Tribhuvan University in Nepal, and he received his master's degree in physical land resources from Ghent University in Belgium, and a PhD After obtaining Berkeley National Laboratory, he joined Argonne National Laboratory as an assistant geospatial scientist in 2012. After working as a geospatial scientist at Argonne, further from 2015 to 2020, Dr. Mishra joined the Sandia National Laboratories as a principal member of the technical staff, where he manages a research team on computational environmental science. So welcome everyone, and a special welcome to Dr. Umakant Mishra for leading us in this webinar today. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to you, Dr. Mishra.
So I hope you guys can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thank you so much, Brendan, for a very generous introduction. I sincerely appreciate it. And I wholeheartedly appreciate this opportunity that I'm talking to this ADRA International. And through ADRA, I'm talking to people around the world. You guys are making real changes in human lives. And we, as a scientist, we create new knowledge. But that knowledge dissemination part, I think, is heavily carried up by you guys. I sincerely appreciate that. So I'll be talking today on the topic of carbon farming. And first, I will try to start the conversation by putting some data on global carbon cycle and what do we mean by carbon sequestration when we say it. And then I will get into the definition of carbon farming. What does it mean? How people are doing in different parts of the world. And then I will get into some of my own research that I have been conducting in this area. And at the end, I would like to take questions from you guys. And I look forward for a very productive discussion. Thank you. So when I was looking for the global carbon numbers, this is the figure that I found, which which is the most recent number that is available and which is also peer reviewed. So what this slide says that we as a humanity, we are emitting about 10.6 petagram of carbon annually to the atmosphere. Out of these emissions, roughly half of the carbon, that is 5.1 petagram, stays in the atmosphere, and about 1/4, about 3 petagram, is absorbed by terrestrial ecosystems that consist of vegetation, soils, and wetlands, and about 2.8 petagram of carbon is absorbed by oceans annually. Now, when we say carbon sequestration, what we generally mean is taking out carbon where it has lower residence time and putting it into the components of Earth system where it has a longer residence time. So an example would be, if you take atmospheric carbon and put it into oceans, it will be oceanic carbon sequestration. Similarly, if you take this atmospheric carbon and put it into geologic strata, it will be called as a geologic carbon sequestration. But here I'll be talking about soil carbon sequestration or terrestrial carbon sequestration. The idea is to take carbon from the atmosphere and put it into global vegetations and soils where it can stay from decade to millennia. Now, looking at the global carbon emission trends, if you look at the figure on the left side, the top figure shows how much carbon we have been emitting to atmosphere since 1985 or 1880. So you will see that there is an exponential increase in the magnitude of carbon that we are emitting to the atmosphere. The figure on the bottom is showing that our terrestrial ecosystems, which consists of global vegetations, wetlands, and soils, are also absorbing almost at the similar trend of what we are emitting to the atmosphere. Now, this is very important, and it has a global significance, this figure has, because if you think of whether if there is an absence of this terrestrial carbon sink, or if our terrestrial ecosystems will not have been absorbing the atmospheric CO2, then the global warming would have been much, much higher than what we are experiencing now. Now, if you look at the figure to your right, this is the summary of a current IPCC report, which shows that there is no consensus among the Earth system models that whether our terrestrial ecosystems will keep on absorbing the atmospheric CO2 or they will start emitting atmospheric CO2 from soils to the atmosphere. Now, therefore, predicting, protecting, and enhancing this terrestrial carbon sink is the greatest scientific challenge of our time. Now, you might have a question like, when we are talking about global carbon cycle, why we are talking about soils, or why we have to care about soils. So soils are the largest terrestrial carbon reservoir, and to a 1 meter depth, soils hold about twice of the magnitude of carbon that is currently in atmosphere. Because it has a very large pool, even if there is a small change to this big carbon pool, it can have dramatic impacts on atmospheric carbon concentration and potential climate carbon feedbacks in the future. The interesting part is that soils can act both as source and sink of atmospheric CO2, depending on the climate and land use. For example, climate means, let's say, if there is an extreme event, then it will alter the balance of the role of soils from absorbing to emitting. Similarly, if there is a dramatic land use change, it can also alter the balance of soil carbon. That is why the current Earth system models are trying to capture the storage and dynamics of soil organic carbon in their model representations, so that the uncertainties that exist in carbon climate feedback projections can be reduced. Now, not all soils are the same. Soils have also names like plants, vegetations, and humans. And the USDA system of soil taxonomy classifies the global soils into 12 categories. And these soils live in different parts of the world, as shown in this map. Now, the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that these soils have different chemistry, physics, and biological properties. That is why they respond differently to the changes in land use and climate. Now, there has been sufficient literature that demonstrates that by changing the soil carbon concentration, we are producing a positive or good changes in soil functions. Or in other words, we are improving soil's health, that is soil's ability to function better. There have been evidence that if there is an increase in soil organic carbon, it increases the physical, chemical, biological, and ecological properties and functioning of soils, through which we derive a number of ecosystem services. That is why famous colleagues like Ratan Lal and Michael Smith mentioned that soil organic carbon is not only a soil, but it's an ecosystem property. Now, with some background in the global carbon cycle and global carbon numbers, now I would like to get into the topic of carbon farming. So the USDA has defined that carbon farming is adoption of soil carbon enhancing practices, which we can practice on cultivated lands, which improves soil health. This can be adoption of cover crops. This can be cultivating bioenergy crops. It can be retaining the crop residues in the croplands. It can be reduced or no tillage. Similarly, there are many more activities. And the figure here is demonstrating the carbon farming practices that has been recommended by USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Services. There are about 31 carbon farming practices which have been documented in literature, but they will not be as efficient at all the sites. I will show you later in my research results that the impact of these carbon farming practices will be soil and site specific. Now, literature also suggests that there are basically two kinds of farming practices. One kind of farming practices that we call as extractive farming practices, which means that we are only taking out from soil. We are not giving back. This kind of farming practices can be crop residue removal, excessive tillage, negative soil carbon budget, negative nutrient and energy budgets. So if we practice extractive farming practices, which is unfortunately being practiced to the large part of the global croplands, we get into this spiral decline where we degrade the structure of soil, and there is a decline in soil carbon pool. And ultimately, there is a decline in soil and environmental quality, and our soils become more susceptible to the changes in land use and climate. However, if we practice what we call as a carbon farming practices, what we tend to do is that we tend to retain the crop residue in the field. If we try to adopt cover cropping, integrated nutrient management, minimum tillage, agroforestry, and many more practices, we get into spiral increase and we restore the lost soil's ability and environmental quality. As a result, we enhance the agroecosystem resilience. And what I mean by agroecosystem resilience is soil's ability to better buffer the changes in land use and climate. Now, I created this cartoon to demonstrate how much atmospheric carbon can we sequester in global soils. So my colleague Jonathan Sanderman and colleagues from Woods Hole Research Institute, they published a paper in 2017 where they beautifully quantified how much carbon we as humans have lost to atmosphere by cultivating land. And their number is around 133 petagram of carbon. So this is the amount of carbon that we lost by cultivating global croplands. Now, if we adopt carbon farming practices like I demonstrated earlier, we may be able to reach to that historic carbon loss, or we can regain the carbon in the soils to the level of historic carbon loss. But there are advanced approaches. For example, some of our colleagues are working in modifying the plant root properties. They are trying to genetically engineer soil microbes. And if we adopt those kind of advanced approaches, we can potentially enhance the soil carbon levels to a much higher level than what we lost historically by cultivating soils. And the theoretical technical potential for global croplands is about 3.8 petagram of carbon per year, and this could last about hundreds of years in order to achieve the lost carbon from the terrestrial ecosystems. Now, there is another school of thought. I also come into that category, is that this how much carbon global vegetation and soils can hold under changing land use and climate is uncertain. Because with the climate, because these earlier estimates were made without considering the climate change. But if you consider the impacts of climate change, the climate change is altering a number of soil forming factors. For example, climate, vegetation type, topography, and many more soil forming factors are getting impacted through climate change. So I believe they will reach a new equilibrium, and this equilibrium will keep on changing. So this the magnitude of carbon that could be stored into soils is a research question, and it needs to be answered by considering the carbon climate feedback calculations, which has not been done yet so far. Now, in this slide, I'm trying to show how a soil organic carbon concentration is related with major crop yields. So if you look at the figures on the left, all these figures are showing the empirical evidence that if you increase the carbon concentration in soils, the crop yields such as wheat, maize, and cowpea are increasing significantly. So that means if we want to increase this crop productivity, maybe most efficient tool is to increase the soil organic carbon concentration into soils. With these box plots, we are showing that if you increase a ton of soil organic carbon in soils, how the yield of different crops will increase. And our data, this is the study that our team conducted, is showing that we have much more impact on maize yield than other crops such as wheat, rice, and beans. Now, we published a recent study in last December in Advances in Soil Science, and where we looked at how the soil organic matter composition is related to different ecosystem services. And for example, what this pie chart suggests that when we say soil organic matter, we are basically saying different constituents. So for example, soil organic matter can have mineral associated organic matter, which is in 30 to 90% of the volume. Similarly, soil organic matter has something called particulate organic matter, which is 10 to 70% of the soil volume. Soil organic matter also has microbial carbon, and that is roughly about 1 to 3% of the soil volume. And similarly, the dissolved organic matter has 2% of the soil organic matter volume. And all these major constituents of soil organic matter are related to different ecosystem services, we can say, that we derive from soil, such as the carbon sequestration, nutrient supply, water retention, and crop production. Now, we looked at the literature, the existing literature, and tried to figure out how soil organic carbon content is related with different good soil properties. So what our results suggest that with increase in soil organic carbon content, there is also increase in total nitrogen content. So what this means is that if you can maintain the soil organic carbon level in the soils, you have to fertilize less, or the soils will need less nitrogen to produce the same amount of or better crop yields. This is called enhanced nutrient use efficiency. Similarly, what we are also documenting is that with increase in soil organic carbon content, the total soil porosity increases. And what does that mean is that in soils, there are two kinds of pores, macropores and micropores. Macropores are generally filled with air, and micropores are generally filled with water. So if you increase in the soil organic carbon content, you will increase the number of those micro and macropores, and as a result, you will need less irrigation to produce a better crop yields. Now, in this slide, we are showing how adoption of different carbon farming practices changes different soil properties and where we are finding the increase in carbon in soil organic matter constituents, as I described earlier. So, for example, if you apply biochar in croplands, you are seeing a greater increase in particulate organic matter carbon and mineral associated organic matter carbon, which suggests that this biochar application is probably a good tool to enhance carbon sequestration. And one thing I want to mention is that the dotted line at 1 represents that there is no change by adoption of these farming practices. So what these empirical data suggests that the biochar application, agroforestry application, and applying organic matter amendment in the crop fields does increase crop yield, and it enhances the soil organic matter carbon constituents. Now I will get into another study where we conducted in US Mid-East. And the idea of this study was to predict the change in soil organic carbon pool due to land use change at a regional scale. And our specific objective was to develop an advanced and practical approach to assess the soil carbon sequestration through no-till and crop residue retention in croplands. And we also wanted to quantify the uncertainty in estimates of the rate of soil organic carbon change. Now, IPCC has very beautifully, compiled all the different ways that we can use to predict soil organic carbon change. And they have categorized basically 3 categories: tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So the tier 1 approach, what it is in essence, is that we can use the FAO maps of the whole world, and you can use their reference carbon stock values and emission removal factors, and you can create a balance net greenhouse gas emissions from your land area. It can be a country, it can be certain region, and you can produce the what we call as carbon inventory. And all the countries, I think almost all, yeah, we can say that countries which have which are participating in UNFCCC, which are signatory of IPCC, they document their carbon change annually and report them by using one of these approaches. And tier 2 approach is the approach which can be used for the countries which have completed their soil survey, or what does that mean is that they have identified the kind of soils they have in their country or region, and that they have sampled it, and they have the baseline data. And if you have that kind of situation, then you can use country-specific data of reference carbon stocks and emission removal factors from literature, and you can produce a more accurate inventory of soil carbon change. Similarly, there is a tier 3 approach which advocates that the best way to quantify the change in soil organic carbon is basically sampling twice: once before the intervention of any kind of management, and once after the intervention. And you take the difference between these values and you document that as a change. Probably that's the gold standard. And another way of documenting soil carbon change is to use process-based modeling approaches, which I will be talking about later on in my talk. So as you move from tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, the complexity and the prediction accuracy increases of these carbon inventory approaches. However, if you look at the countries which have adopted these kind of approaches, you'll see that almost 90% of the countries which document their soil carbon change or greenhouse gas emissions use the tier 1 approach, because it's simple, it's applicable everywhere, and people are using it. In this study, what we attempted was to modify the tier 2 approach by using geostatistics, and then try to compare it with tier 3 approach, how better or worse we are performing. So we conducted this study in the 7 states of US Mid-East, and the black dots are showing the validation samples at about 17 or 19 points. And here we combined the tier 2 approach of carbon inventory approach with geostatistics, and we predicted the impact of land use change on carbon stock. And the map on your right is showing the figure of the changes in soil organic carbon in 0 to 30 centimeters. And we published this study in 2012. And now IPCC has adopted this methodology as one of their recommended practice to improve the accuracy of soil carbon change. Now, we conducted another study where we tried to look at the efficacy of bioenergy crops in enhancing soil carbon sequestration. So the idea here was not to deploy miscanthus cultivation all over the US, but to identify the hot spots where we can find a highest soil carbon gains and which are the areas where we don't have to irrigate in order to get the economic biomass yield of miscanthus. So this is the way we do our work typically. And when I was younger, I used to think that if you use the complex modeling approaches, probably your papers get higher number of citations. But I don't agree with this approach now. And maybe with my age, I'm trying to get more wiser, I would say. So in this approach, we have combined two process-based modelings with geospatial modeling. And we try to quantify the potential soil organic carbon sequestration rate across the continental United States if you cultivate miscanthus in croplands. We also quantified the cropland area which needs supplemental irrigation to produce economic yield. And here we have considered that if you produce 10 tons per hectare of dried biomass, then that's an economic yield. And we also identified land areas where you can cultivate miscanthus biomass yield without irrigation to an economic yield. And these are our results. So what these results suggest that there is a large variability in miscanthus yield if you cultivate it through the continental United States. And the Western United States are almost half the area of continental United States will produce less than 10 tons per hectare per year. That means these land areas are not suitable for biomass, miscanthus biomass production if you only rely on rainfall. And by adopting this miscanthus, there will be differential changes in soil organic carbon content, which is demonstrated by the figure on your left. And what these numbers suggest that you can get 0.16 ton per hectare per year carbon sequestration up to 1 ton per hectare per year. And these are net carbon sequestration values. That means these numbers we have generated by taking account of the carbon that is used when you cultivate the crops. We have subtracted that, and we are recommending our net carbon gains in soils. Now, there are different reasons why miscanthus will sequester carbon into soils. The first thing is that miscanthus places the organic matter deeper into the soil profile. And through cultivating, because it's a perennial crop, you are eliminating tillage. And you are also changing the decomposability by increasing the carbon to nitrogen ratio. That is why you get higher carbon sequestration by adopting miscanthus in comparison to other crops. Now, in this figure, what I'm trying to make a point that water is a great control on carbon sequestration. The carbon that you are sequestering by cultivating miscanthus is not coming for free. It needs water to grow the crops. And the figure on your left is showing the effective rainfall. And the way I define effective rainfall is that this is the amount of rainfall that you will get during the cropping season in continental United States. And then we have calculated the water holding capacity across thousands of soil profiles in continental US. And then we have retained only the water that soil can hold during the cropping season which will be utilized to grow miscanthus crop. Using this data, we have classified the croplands and tried to identify the areas where we can get economic yield without supplemental irrigation. And these areas are represented in white and green colors in the figure on your right. And our calculation suggests that there are about 14 million hectare croplands, which are primarily located at eastern United States, will sustain miscanthus production to its potential yield without supplemental irrigation. And another 67 million hectare would support lower but economically viable miscanthus yield in the continental United States. Now I will talk about another study that we published in 2020. And in this study, we looked at the similar idea. If you grow sorghum, how the soil organic carbon concentration will change, and also what will be the changes in nitrous oxide emission throughout the croplands of US. And in this study, we use a model called the DECADAL model to do our simulations, which needs a large number of land use data, climate data, and soils data to run this model. And we have run this model across 4-kilometer grid throughout the croplands of US. So this figure is showing what would be the biomass yield of sorghum you will get if you cultivate it throughout the continental United States. And our data is suggesting that you will get a harvestable biomass of sorghum, which will range from 1.5 ton per hectare per year to about 20 tons per hectare per year. And the figure on your top is showing that the distribution of sorghum biomass yield across continental United States, which you can harvest and which are dried biomass in the field. Now, with adopting sorghum, the results are different than miscanthus. If you remember the miscanthus figure, what you will see that by adopting miscanthus everywhere in the continental United States, you are seeing the signs of positive carbon sequestration. But miscanthus will have a differential impact. There will be some areas where you will sequester carbon, and in this figure, these areas are represented by the green color. And there are some areas where you will release carbon to the atmosphere. So adopting sorghum cultivation in continental United States will have a differential impact on soil carbon sequestration across continental United States. Now, by combining the data of soil carbon emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, we have classified the US croplands again into different areas of how the productivity and net carbon emission will look like in the continental United States. So if you look at this light blue and deep blue area are the area where sorghum cultivation will result into net carbon sequestration. And the red and brown areas are the areas where sorghum cultivation will result into net carbon emissions. So the idea of this kind of analysis is not to recommend the entire croplands for bioenergy cultivation, but to identify hot spots where we can deploy these bioenergy crops in order to sequester carbon. We also conducted another study where we looked at the vulnerability of soil organic carbon, or under different emission scenarios of IPCC, how much carbon will we lose from the croplands due to climate extremes. And for this study, we used the soil organic carbon observations as reflected by this figure here. These are about 6,200 13 data sets, and we acquired this data from USDA NRCS. And as I have earlier suggested that the change in soil organic carbon impacts other soil properties. Therefore, information on high resolution of soil organic carbon vulnerability will help us to deploy the carbon sequestration approaches on the areas where the soil carbon is more vulnerable. And these days, in our modeling world, people are recommending that machine learning approaches are providing better results, both for predicting soil carbon storage and also dynamics. So this is showing the result of the continental United States, and what we are showing here that how the 30 environmental factors control the continental United States soil organic carbon stock. So our results are showing that annual precipitation, potential evapotranspiration, and soil drainage conditions are probably the top 3 environmental factors which are controlling the carbon stocks of continental United States. And soil temperature regime, potential vegetation, and slope position of land surface probably has a lesser control on continental United States soil organic carbon stocks. Now, in this figure, what I'm trying to show is that the results that we got from ensemble machine learning approaches and the results we are getting from ensemble Earth system model results. You will see that as we move from emission scenario of moderate emission scenario to high emission scenario, that is SSP to 4.5 to SSP 5, 8.5, you will see that the regions from where we will emit soil carbon in continental United States will increase. If you look at the ensemble mean of Earth system model results, you are seeing a different pattern than what we are getting from machine learning approaches. However, we found a consensus among these 2 different kind of modeling approaches is that no matter what, the croplands and wetlands of continental United States are projected to lose carbon in the continental US. So that means the carbon sequestration techniques need to be deployed in the croplands and wetlands and not in forest or grasslands in the continental US. Now, with this figure, I'm trying to show the ensemble mean result that we obtained from machine learning approaches, which shows the trajectory of soil organic carbon change by 2100 in continental United States. And the figure on your right is showing the results of how this soil organic carbon change has been documented in current Earth system models. So the fundamental differences that we see that machine learning approaches are not in agreement with Earth system models in predicting both decadal and total change. And among the Earth system models also, there is a great difference between how this change is represented. For example, some Earth system models are suggesting a soil carbon gain in continental US, and some Earth system models are suggesting soil carbon loss. And if you take ensemble mean of these Earth system models, which is normally practiced in modeling world, you will see that there is basically no change in continental US soil organic carbon stocks. Now, what we found that though these models disagree, we have identified the land areas where both machine learning and Earth system models agree and disagree in predicting the direction of soil organic carbon change. I think this finding is very powerful, and our paper was just published a couple of weeks ago, and we hope that this will get attention. And in this study, we have predicted the magnitude of soil organic carbon loss under moderate and high emission scenarios, and we have documented the areas of improvement in Earth system models so that we can use it for better predictions in future. Now, I hope you guys are still on the track and trying to listen me. But one another area where we are conducting our research is to quantify the magnitude of climate extremes and try to see how that can impact the biomass or agricultural productivity. So in this slide, we are showing the results of 3 Earth system models and how they compare with observations. So if you look at the figure on your left, what you'll see that if you look at the total amount of rainfall that we get in continental United States, this is almost same in observations and in different kind of Earth system models. But if you look at the number of rain days, then it seems that in observations, we get about 90 days of rainfall in continental US. However, the models show a very large number of rainfall days, and we call it a drizzling impact in Earth system models. So what this means that we cannot use the Earth system model data as it is for our purpose. They need to be downscaled, they need to be bias corrected, and we need to quantify the climate extreme events in the Earth system model data. Then only we can use that for our modeling purposes or to make inferences for the future climate change. So in this slide, what we have calculated the number of extreme events both in spring and summer in the continental United States, and we show that the number of extreme wet and severe dry days are changing from season to season in future climate data up to 2100. And if you look at the continental United States figure, what we are showing that the red triangles are showing that the ensemble mean of drought or dry days are going to increase in continental United States in future. And we are hoping to use this kind of data to predict bioenergy productivity, to quantify its impact on soil carbon change and greenhouse gas emissions. So now I'm at the last slide of my presentation. And what I have tried to explain is that carbon farming practices sequester atmospheric CO2 in soils and make agroecosystem more resilient to climate and land use change. And by coupling the process-based modeling with geospatial modeling, we can identify the spatial locations that will either sequester or release carbon under different land use and management scenarios. And I have also showed that the ensemble machine learning approach are producing more accurate results than Earth system models in predicting soil carbon vulnerability under future climate. And at Sandia, our team is trying to couple surface hydrology and biology, that's recent advancements that are being made in plant root engineering and microbial ecology, with climate to understand what is the role that soil plays in regulating the terrestrial carbon cycle. Because it's not only climate that moderates soil, but also soil moderates the climate, as I have tried to show in this figure here. With this, I would like to thank you all for your attention. And I have been privileged that my research so far has been supported by US Department of Energy, Office of Science. Thank you so much. And with this, I would love to take questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for the presentation to us. A number of questions that have come through into those, but my question a little bit is a big picture analysis at a global level. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we have emitted excess CO2 into the atmosphere of around about 1,600 gigatons. And we have also lost significant forest cover over the last 300 years. Currently, at a global level, we have 1.6 billion hectares of cropping land. We have about 3.1 billion hectares of pasture-based grazing land. And we have about 4.2 billion hectares of forest cover. Given that we have over the last 30 years emitted more than 800 gigatons into the atmosphere in terms of excess CO2, and given where we are, the situation we are at, where we have progressively over the last 300 years lost significant forest cover, increased the grazing and pasture land areas as a result of that loss of forest cover, and also the cropping areas. Is carbon farming techniques where we work in a systematic way to rebuild soil carbon, rebuild soil organic matter that is stable, do we have enough tools to reverse the already excess CO2 that we have compared to pre-industrial levels, plus the projected 40 to 45 gigatons of excess emissions that we are currently emitting per year? Does soil offer us the solution?
Thank you so much, Brendan. I sincerely appreciate the way you summarize the carbon numbers and your questions about soil's role in this, everything that you say. Now, my answer to this question is no. Only soils cannot reverse everything. That's what you explained. But what I strongly believe is soils are part of the solution, and this solution have to have different components. For example, reducing carbon intensity in industrialization. There are my colleagues which are working on reducing carbon emissions from waste utilization. Some of my colleagues are working on how to reduce carbon intensity from electricity generation. Because we are emitting carbon from different sources and activities, only soils cannot absorb all that carbon. However, the beauty of the science that I do is that, for example, if you take carbon from atmosphere and if you put into oceans, you are creating another problem of ocean acidification. If you are taking carbon from atmosphere and putting into geologic strata or conducting geologic carbon sequestration, has enormous energy use. And there are a lot of uncertainties that we don't know. For example, what will happen if there is an earthquake comes. Now, looking at all these uncertainties and problems, what I do believe that sequestering carbon in soils is a win-win scenario. For what I mean by that is, when carbon is in atmosphere, it's a problem to many or more processes. But if somehow we can take that carbon and put it into soil, it becomes nutrient. It becomes a fertilizer. It enhances the soil's productivity to do many more ecosystem services. So the carbon per unit carbon sequestered in soils have large number of multiplier effects. And there are a number of scientists who are specializing in this domain, what we call as ecosystem service quantification. So that is why I think sequestering carbon in soils is important, and it should be part of the solution. When people say that, like your question was indicating that, oh, we have emitted such an enormous amount of CO2 already into atmosphere, so that soils can take only small part of them. I agree to that. There is soil's ability to take carbon is probably limited and uncertain. But by sequestering carbon into soils, we are providing enormous service to humanity by impacting their livelihoods in a number of different ways. And that still needs to be quantified. For example, I tried to demonstrate in my presentation that if you enhance carbon content into soils, you are storing more water into the soil profile. That means your soils are more resistant to extreme droughts that we might face under future climate. By sequestering carbon into soils, you are enhancing the biodiversity of soil. By sequestering carbon into soil, you are making soils more, the aggregate and pore structure more suitable, which will have better nutrient cycling. So there are many benefits for doing soil carbon sequestration. It's not only the magnitude. However, if you look at these carbon farming practices, it is sad to say that among the billions of hectares of land globally, it's only used 10 to 15% of the land. But the areas where this kind of carbon farming practices are being practiced are the developed parts of the world. For example, these are countries in United States, or countries in Latin America, such as Brazil and other countries. They have the largest cropland area under carbon farming practices. And in United States, I think current administration, and not only current, from last several administrations, they are paying farmers for adopting carbon farming practices. So the idea is, if a farmer adopts a carbon farming practice, and if he sequesters X amount of carbon, they are paid for the ecosystem services that they are generating from their soils. Thank you.
Okay. We have a number of questions that have come up. The first one is from Tom Benton. He's saying, having done several projects with biochar treatments, I have a question. How much of the increase in soil organic carbon is due to increased productivity and crop residues, and how much is due to the carbon treatment via biochar itself? Does biochar charcoal slow the degradation and release carbon at a slower rate? The answer is yes. But I also tried to show in my presentation the results of biochar application in croplands. Mm-hmm. There are emerging number of studies which document the role of biochar in sequestering carbon. So in a layman perspective, what biochar actually does is it acts like a sponge. If you put it into the soil system, it absorbs large amount of moisture. As a result, it sequesters carbon, or carbon gets less decomposed. And we have also showed that, I also showed in my presentation that by adding biochar into soils, among different carbon constituents of soil organic matter, you are increasing the mineral associated organic matter and the particulate organic matter. So that is why by adopting a biochar cultivation, you are sequestering carbon. And this is a good thing to do. Mm. And I think some of the oldest empirical evidence of adopting biochar actually comes from Amazon forest, where their natives have been using biochar cultivation since thousands of years. Okay, thank you. Second question is from Salil Batarai. He's saying, thanks for the insightful presentation. Is there a way of estimating carbon sequestration in our work without having to go through complex modeling processes? Yes. So that was the reason why I showed this IPCC carbon inventory approaches.
And I try to summarize in that slide what are the ways that you can use to document soil carbon change. Now, there are, I think, 90% of the countries in the world currently use Tier 1 approach, and which is by using the FAO maps of initial soil carbon stocks for a different country or a region, and then multiplying it by recommended emission and carbon removal factors. You can create a carbon inventory. You can create your own soil carbon change estimates. However, those estimates will have higher uncertainty. And as I tried to explain in my slide, that as you move to a greater number of tiers, for example, if you are able to adopt Tier 2, your uncertainties will be lesser than Tier 1. If you are able to adopt Tier 3, your uncertainties will be much more constrained. So the use of these approaches depends on the resources one has to his disposal and what are the data sets that are available. On the basis of that, people can use different tiers of predicting soil carbon change. But I think we do have ability to run our analysis globally. Yeah, please.
Okay. The next question is from Richard Librock. He's asking, can you elaborate on the role of sequestered soil organic carbon plays to enhance the water cycle, which has effectively governed the heat dynamics of the planet for millennia?
Yes, I think I used significant part of my presentation and slides to show how change in soil organic matter changes the soil porosity, and how the changing porosity means that we'll sequester more water into soil system by increasing the soil organic matter content. And what does that mean is that when we have more soil moisture available in the soil profile during the growing season, that means we will have less severe impact from future droughts. So it has been well documented. I think I'm not the first one to make this statement. But what we have also shown from our research is that there is a very significant relationship between increase in soil carbon concentration and changes in soil porosity. That's what our empirical evidence suggests. And that means that to fight against desertification or to better buffer the impacts of future climate extremes, increasing soil carbon concentration or soil organic matter is one good tool we can use.
Okay, thank you. May I ask you to go back in your presentation to one of the earlier slides where you showed a diagram highlighting the many different approaches to carbon farming, where you had many examples of different types of carbon farming.
Yeah, this one.
Yes, this one. I've seen some excellent presentations actually through a TED talk some years ago, where an example in the US, in Nebraska, where some farmers inherited land quite topsoil had declined down about 3 inches in depth. And over a 20-year period, this was in Nebraska, they rebuilt through adopting initially a few of the techniques, but ultimately almost all of the techniques that you have listed here, including the ones where livestock are integrated with cropping systems and where there's multiple alley cropping and relay cropping, et cetera, and they have rebuilt their soil depth to 14 inches or around about 35 centimeters. And at the same time, they have moved their soil organic matter content from less than 1.7% soil organic matter up to over 11% soil organic matter. And that equates to an increase in soil organic carbon levels of over 500 tons per hectare has been sequestered within their system. And it was really interesting when they started just adopting a few systems, their progress was relatively slow, but when they adopted multiple systems collectively that you've listed here, then their progress really started to take off quite fast. So, but it took about 2 decades to go from 1.7% soil organic matter content up to over 11%. It took about 2 decades to get there. But the first decade, they only moved from 1.7 up to about 6%. But even 6% soil organic matter content is fairly high. And then the next decade, they moved from 6 to over 11, which is extremely high in terms of soil organic matter content. Looking at that, I mean, adopting multiple approaches seems to be an accelerator from what, can you comment on that?
Excellent, Brendan. I think you are talking like a soil scientist, and I'm very pleased to see that. And you quoted a very nice result that I was not aware of. But I have published a study from Brazil, and where a PhD student was working with me when I was at Argonne. And our idea was to look at these conservation agriculture practices, that is crop residue retention, not plowing, and doing integrated nutrient management. So 3 approaches that they used in Brazil. And the
Brendan, we are not hearing Dr. Mishra.
Yeah, Dr. Mishra, we have lost your audio, sorry, for some reason. You are mute. You need to unmute yourself. Sorry, we still can't hear you. Apologies, we still cannot hear you. Can you hear us okay? Sorry, it seems like we've frozen, and Dr. Mishra has lost his audio. Can anyone else still hear me?
Yes, Brendan, we can hear you.
Okay. So, Dr. Mishra, our apologies. It seems like you have a technical problem. It seems like the rest of us can hear each other. Afia, Afia, you were mentioning we need to wrap up by a certain time. Is that...
Yeah, we were supposed to end at 11 and it's 11:07 now. So maybe we can start to wrap up.
Yes. Okay. So just a very big thank you to Dr. Mishra for his presentation at webinar, and thank you everyone for joining in and for the very appropriate questions that you had. I'd like to thank the Livelihoods Technical Learning Lab, and particularly Salil, for arranging for Dr. Mishra to share with us his expertise. We definitely would like to keep in touch with Dr. Mishra and continue the dialogue on the scientific aspects and how we can bring that into practical aspects in terms of the livelihood and agricultural work that ADRA is doing globally. Clearly, across the 1.6 billion hectares of cropping land globally, we need to have a dramatic impact. And across the 3.2 billion hectares of rangeland, grassland, grazing land, we also need to have an impact if we are going to turn this carbon and climate crisis around. So thank you again, Dr. Mishra, and thank you everyone for participating. And thank you, Afia, for hosting us. I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, everyone. We will share the recording and also the PowerPoint that was used by Dr. Mishra when we share the summary of the webinar. Thank you all. It's been nice having you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.